Hi, Samarth. Good morning. Congratulations on your admit to ISB.
Thank you. Thanks for
Right.
the help.
Always welcome. So, Samarth, this is a long journey, applying to any B school, especially ISB. So, how has it been for you? And also tell us about your work experience, your profile, and your results so far.
Sure. So for me, ISB is a 2-year journey. So I'm actually a reapplicant this year. My first application was in 2021. That time I had about 2 years of work ex, and I took a year off from all the MBA applications, worked on my profile, and came back this year. So coming to my core stats, I have 4 years of work ex in consulting at Deloitte, India, mostly on digital transformation around those type of topics. And then I have an engineering undergrad, B.Tech from a Tier 2 college in Bangalore, and my GPA was around 8.5. 10th and 12th also was like 9.2 and 86%. And I had a GRE score this year, so I applied with a 331. And I also had my older GMAT score as well, which was like a 710, but I used the GRE only this year.
And for ISB, I think you've been awarded a very good scholarship as well.
Yeah. I got a 50% merit waiver, tuition waiver.
So, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you are selecting your MBA programs? What are the factors that are important?
Sure. So for me, what drew me to ISB as well was the peer group, right? So I wanted to sit in a class with people who had already worked in industry. I specifically looked at programs where, the average age and the average work ex was slightly higher than the traditional programs which have MBA programs in India, at least a minimum of 3 to 4 years. So my targets are always ISB or some foreign B schools for this criteria alone, as well as having some sort of experiential learning program. So in ISB, there's the ELP, and similar programs abroad would have like something like Ross as a MAP program, which is like an action-based learning program. These are the two main criteria which I was looking at. ISB being a 1-year program is also a plus because I spent only 1 year away from the workforce, but it was not something that was like a make or break for me, but it's still a positive addition.
And when you wrote the GMAT initially and then you moved towards GRE, so what was the decision making, GMAT versus GRE, and how was the preparation adapted, etc.?
I had a GMAT score of 710 from my earlier application, so I wasn't really sure it would be super competitive for ISB this year, because I think the average GMAT has been going up to 720 and probably beyond this year. I remember I came to you and I was worried with this question whether my GMAT is enough, whether I would need to retake. The only problem is right now I'm in a much higher position than I was previously at my work, so I have very little free time to sit and prepare for months on end. Especially when I came to you planning my application this year was already probably close to July or August. I remember looking at the GRE questions, and I had a book from when I was in undergrad where a lot of people were preparing for GRE for master's program abroad. So I thought I would take a mock test and see how close I would be to a competitive score. Ended up doing really well. I think I got a 320 6 or 327 in my first mock test blind. I immediately signed up for this GregMat, GMAT, GRE tuitions. I think it's like a $5 per month subscription. The only weakness I had was probably my vocabulary in terms of the words which are there for GRE. Right? The quant is already, I already had a 169 straight in the mock. So I thought I would need like 2 weeks to prepare my vocabulary and probably to get me to a competitive score. I was targeting a 328, 329 score in the actual GRE. I ended up getting a 331. Once I got the score, I didn't really have any doubt of getting a GMAT, so stuck with the GRE.
And any resources that were helpful for the vocabulary preparation?
The subscription gives you a Excel sheet of like it's called a vocabulary mountain. So you get like 1,000 words and framework to memorize them and keep it internalized. That was the most helpful thing for me. And I already had a strong vocabulary, but this built on top of that. So it helped me also look at the words and how the exam tests you on that word.
Now coming to the application part. So you were a reapplicant, the essays were changed, everything was new this time from the previous application that you had submitted. So how did you go about, deciding on to the personal brand that we wanted to showcase and the storytelling part for the application?
The first step was as a reapplicant was gauging how much my profile had changed from my first application. And I went through my first essays. So the essay I wrote it 2 years back, so the essays were totally different that time. Only one common essay was the goals essay. In my first application, that is the weakest essay in my applications. I went back, revisited what I had written there, decided what would not work this year, what had changed in my individual capacity, what extra stories I could bring, as well as my reapplication journey, what has changed in the last 2 years. So once I noted down those points, along with the questionnaire that you had sent as part of GOALisB's consulting program, I saw what story I could bring to the AdCom from my personal experience, and then mapped each. I wrote like a master point list on my desktop, and just try to map each point to a particular essay which is there this year. Each decided, instead of focusing on multiple stories, I would just take. So the first essay this year was pretty open-ended regarding your personal stories. We had a lot of conversation around how to go about this. We had a couple of rewrites, but I stuck to the point that my personal journey is more important than showcasing how impressive I am as a applicant. I focus more on showing how my growth has been through college, working, and then what I've done at work. And then the second essay was again more about your biggest strength and weakness. That again was a part. So we had the questionnaire from GOALisB where you had to write down your strengths and weaknesses. So I just stuck to the biggest story I could bring out of one strength and the biggest story I could bring out from one weakness, and try to tie them up together. And then the goals essay this year, which is optional, I did write it because I had a shift in goals for my first application. I wrote I wanted to be a product manager in my first application without any research, nothing. So it was a very weak goal. This year, I stuck to what my background was in consulting, and I personally as well, I wanted to shift the goal. I really don't want to be a PM this year. I stuck to a goal which is realistic, which is achievable, and something which I could tie my previous skills back into the goal, as well as what ISB is strong for. So having these three as my main essays that's where I focus on, bringing out my story this year. And then for the reapplication essay, like the initial points which I mentioned about what I changed, I just wrote that down in a context summary. That's it.
And finally, the interview, what was the interview experience like? What worked in your favor with respect to getting the scholarship as well?
This year's interview, I was actually pretty nervous going into the interview because as this year was different than the first time during COVID. So this year they gave out most interview invites in 1 week. It was location based. My first interview was a very stress-based interview, so that kept replaying in my head this year. When I went into the interview hall, it was a much different atmosphere than my first interview. It was a more friendlier, and it is a much shorter interview than last time as well. So if there's any fixed format, what I would suggest is just being comfortable with your story, comfortable with your goals, and having a clear idea of what you want to do post ISB. I think that's what the alums are looking for, as well as having an idea of what your profile is and what you could provide to the class as one of the candidates in the ISB classroom. Because almost everyone there is like pretty accomplished in their professional journey. Each one has their own story. So just highlighting what you can bring to the table and what you can take out of ISB. And if you're very clear on that, I think you can ace the interview no matter what you've done.
All of this goes together into, your selection as for a tuition waiver or a merit waiver. Acing every part of the application process would be important in getting there,
Yes.
not just the GMAT or the GRE part.
Okay. What made me select you guys was first of all, the free call which we had initially to scope out both my candidature as well as how you could help me was very illuminating. I think you were the one consultant who said, okay, there's no need to rewrite the GMAT or GRE. Your GMAT is actually good enough. You just need to focus on your application. That brought some sort of confidence that, hey, my candidature is actually pretty good apart from the GMAT score. So, and then the detailed feedback, you give the questionnaire where it was almost as detailed as a proper MBA application itself on its own. So that sort of is like a pre-prep for your essays or whatever application stories you're going to write. So that shortened the process quite a bit for me to bring out stories and think about how I could portray those stories for each question. Having a consultant who's confident in your own background without suggesting too much changes or suggesting something is not possible. So that is, I think, the biggest green flag you can get in a consultant, as well as how detailed the question is, so that it's very tailor-made to your application instead of sending up a cookie cutter application, which everyone from that consultant would have a generic profile. So I think that's the two main criteria which you need to look out for.
One last question, actually. Would you like to share some, tips or a summary of the steps that anybody who's going forward with this process now for the next year applications for them to follow?
Get the GMAT or GRE out of the way as soon as possible. So that's probably the biggest time sink you would have to face in our MBA application journeys. I wrote the GRE with just 2 weeks of preparation in July. So I would definitely not suggest that. If you can get it out, get a score before June, May, June, and it may take around 6 months to a person who's working long hours, especially if you're working in consulting or banking or something. So get that out of the way first, so that your mind is clear, and which is what you need to tackle your essays and your personal story, as well as write down points from your personal journey over the past 2-3 years, which have shaped you as a person or as a leader, because that's what ISB looks for. What has changed? If you have any impactful story, or if you get any impactful point in your head while just thinking about your life, you just note it down in a notebook and then store it somewhere before you start your application process. That's what I would say.
Thank you once again for the time, and congratulations once again.